For a century or so in American life, if you wanted to describe someone as really rich, you might say that they were rich as Rockefeller. And everybody would know who you were talking about. You were talking about John D. Rockefeller, the industrial magnate who created the Standard Oil Trust, who lived from the 1830s into the early part of the 20th century, and who became by far the wealthiest person in American history, certainly up through his lifetime, and even probably the wealthiest person in American history until today, adjusted for things like inflation and the size of the economy. Now, it's true that figures like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, they have more money in current day dollars than John Rockefeller had in his day. His fortune was something like $900 million. But this was back in the early 20th century. And the magnates of today, Bezos, Gates, they have more than $100 billion. So we're talking, lots more money, except in terms of the size of the fortune, of the individual fortune, as compared to the size of the economy. Rockefeller had more weight than the modern moguls. So if you want to describe somebody today as rich, you really couldn't do worse than you could do a lot worse than to say his rich as Rockefeller. So let's consider this question of how you get to be rich as Rockefeller. I'm going to be talking over the course of the next videos, some videos in the future, about how people get rich today. But Rockefeller got rich in the 19th century, and he was one of that first generation of American industrial moguls. And in his case, you got rich by, well, he wasn't born rich. In fact, he was born into a family of very modest means. He was born in upstate New York, and the family bounced around for a while. His father was a traveling salesman and something of a con artist, and so constantly was one step ahead of the sheriff and moving the family from place to place. And they finally landed in near Cleveland, Ohio, which is where John Rockefeller grew up. Now, this is going to be important in the development of John Rockefeller's fortune. So if you're keeping a checklist of how one becomes rich, well, it certainly helps to be in the right place at the right time. The right place, Cleveland, Ohio? Yeah, well, in Cleveland, no reason that most people know this, but Cleveland has had a checkered reputation at times. Sometimes it's called the mistake on the lake. It's on Lake Erie. But Cleveland was an up-and-coming industrial city in the late 19th century, but more important, and I guess I should say one of the reasons it was an up-and-coming industrial city, was it happened to be located near the first of America's great oil discoveries, the oil fields of western Pennsylvania. Now, a brief digression here is important. Oil, petroleum, rock oil sometimes it was called, to distinguish from other kinds of oils based on animal fat and vegetable fat and the like. Rock oil, petroleum. Petroleum means rock oil. Petroleum was this new thing in the 19th century, and before then, people didn't care anything about petroleum. I'll just call it oil. They didn't care anything about oil. In fact, oil was something that they sometimes got annoyed about discovering if they were drilling drilling a water well, and they drill, and they might strike oil. And dang, I wanted to get water. Instead, I got oil. Now the well's messed up, and I have to go drill another well. And the reason for this was there wasn't any large demand. There wasn't anything that consumed a lot of oil. What was required was the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. And at first, what oil was used for was to lubricate the moving parts of steam engines and wheels of railroads and things that had to slide back and forth over each other. So that's what oil was used for originally. By the middle of the 19th century, oil was also used for lighting. In fact, well, oil was refined, and refining oil was something that developed over time. It wasn't something that came naturally. And oil, as it comes out of the ground, doesn't burn very well. You have to break it into its heavier and lighter components. And one of the lighter components, kerosene, it can be used to burn in gas, we'll call them gas or kerosene lanterns. And it goes into a wick and it lights, and it lights up things. And in fact, the principal demand for oil-based products in the time of John Rockefeller was for kerosene. And it allowed people to light up the night. Before the Industrial Revolution, it was difficult and expensive for people to stay up after dark. They could use candles, and okay, candles will get you some light, but they're not very bright. And they were relatively expensive. So rich folks could stay up after dark, poor folks had to go to bed. But with kerosene it cast much greater light, so you could actually read and you could entertain and you could do a lot of the same things you could do during the daytime, but after dark. And that was a big deal. And the key for it was, the key to its widespread adoption was it was relatively inexpensive. And one of the reasons it was relatively inexpensive was as a result of the work of John Rockefeller. So, more on that. Anyway, Rockefeller he grows up in the right place. Cleveland is the city that is closest to these oil fields of western Pennsylvania. If Rockefeller had grown up in Boston, if Rockefeller had grown up in the South, if Rockefeller had grown up even in New York City, he probably would have been successful. He was smart. He was kind of driven, he was really driven. And he probably would have been successful, but he probably would not have achieved the kind of sort of one-of-a-kind success that he achieved. So his great fortune, let's say he probably would have been rich, but he wouldn't have been really rich the way he was. So there's a certain amount of accident of birth and geography involved here. Now, there's something too about the circumstances of his upbringing. His father, as I've said, was a salesman, and I've alluded to, he was a shady character, and he was constantly coming up with schemes for conning people out of their money. He carried this idea of conning people even into his personal life. And John Rockefeller subsequently learned that his father, as a traveling salesman, he's gone for long periods of time, had in fact connected with a woman other than John Rockefeller's mother, and had indeed sired a second family. And so Big Bill Rockefeller was his name. It's Bill. And he's known as Big Bill because he's a big guy. He had these two families. And so John D. Rockefeller eventually figured this part out. But as a kid, he knew that his father wasn't around. He knew that his father was someone who could make money, but he didn't pay too much attention to the details and legalities exactly of how he made that money. Now, that would have an effect on John D. Rockefeller, but maybe not exactly what you might think. But one thing that Bill Rockefeller did to John D. and his brothers was to encourage them to become entrepreneurs, to go into business. An entrepreneur is a person who engages in business enterprise. Basically, we'd call them somebody who runs his or her own business. And this is what the kids were encouraged to do. And so they would go into minor schemes, the equivalent of selling lemonade, or something like that today. And the father, Bill Rockefeller, would encourage his kids to do it, and he would do business with them. But he would deliberately, and he admitted, he would deliberately try to outfox them, try to cheat them. And so they would have to, instead of just trusting their father, they had to check up on him. And he used to boast that this would make them sharp, and this would make them good in business. Now, I don't know if it actually made John D. Rockefeller, and in a relatively young age, John D. Rockefeller insisted on including the D. So he'd rather be called John D. than John Rockefeller, and certainly not Jack or anything like that. So anyway, Rockefeller, he goes into business of one sort or another as a kid. And then when he was in his teens, his father took him and drove him in the buggy into Cleveland and set him up in a boarding house. They paid the first couple months' rent in the boarding house, gave him a little bit of cash and said, okay, kid, you're on your own. And some of this was, I presume, out of a fatherly concern for the success of John Rockefeller, but some of it was, get the kid out of my hair and so I don't have to support him anymore. And John Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, learned to support himself. So you could say that there was this positive accident of where he was born, and he had this father who pointed him in the direction of business. If his father had been a lawyer, if his father had been a minister, he might have gone into a profession. He might have become a doctor if his father had been a doctor, something like that. But he was pointed in the direction of business. Now, timing turned out to be critical as well. John Rockefeller was born in the 1830s, which meant that he was coming of age in the period before and during the Civil War. And the Civil War was this extraordinary shot in the arm to the Northern economy because the government of the United States, the Union government, required all sorts of commodities, all sorts of supplies, everything to make, for making trains. The Union armies rode to victory over the Confederates in no small part because they had greater access to railroads and trains. And so there was all of this federal money, this government money going into industry to stimulate new ideas, new production, all this other stuff. Now this is important because in that era, the United States governments generally, did not provide support to private enterprise as a matter of course. Now later in the 20th century, this idea that the government would fund research into this and that and government contracts would be a big deal. The federal government was not a big deal in the 19th century with the exception of wartime. And the Civil War comes along just as John Rockefeller has decided that the oil business is a good business to go in. So he's in the right place, and he's got the right background, and he's at the right time for all of this stuff to pay off. And the result of this is that John Rockefeller gets in on the ground floor of this new industry, the modern oil industry. Oh, and that's another thing. If you want to be really successful, I should say, if you want to be really rich or successful at business and make lots of money, it's a good idea, or let's say you will be fortunate to be in on the ground floor of some new industry. And the reason for this is if you get into an established industry, well, there are other people who know how to do this and who are able to block your advance. But if you are in an industry where there are no established enterprises and nobody already has a hammerlock on the market, then if you're clever, if you're ambitious, if you're even ruthless, that helps a little bit, then you've got a good chance, or certainly a better chance than you would otherwise, to become the big guy. And this is exactly what John Rockefeller did. So he went into the field of oil refining. Not for John Rockefeller was the grubby business of digging the stuff out of the ground. I mean, digging, actually, eventually they started drilling for oil, and the oil would come up. What Rockefeller would do would be to buy the oil from the producers, and then he would refine it. And as I say, refining oil was a big part of the production process because oil as it comes out of the ground is useful for very few things. But you refine it, you can get kerosene, you can get other things. But kerosene was the thing that was really going to carry Rockefeller's business forward. And he got good at it. He got good at it not because he had any scientific background. He didn't. His education was limited. But he was a practical-minded person. He also was good at hiring people who had expertise that he did not have. And so he lined up people who knew more about the refining process than he did. And he set them to work. Okay, I want you to make this refining process as efficient as can be. I want to become the most efficient, the lowest cost refiner of oil. And he did. He was not shy about investing in new technologies. And if a new technology came along that superseded a technology they just put in, he would go to that one. He would borrow money. He wasn't shy about borrowing money. He would leverage the company as much as he could. And he would install whatever the most efficient production processes, the machinery, the equipment were, so that he could be certain that he could produce oil, he could produce the refined products at a lower cost than anybody else. And he realized that if he could do this, then he could capture an ever larger share of the market. When he began, the oil industry was divided up into dozens, hundreds of different operators, lots of different operators in the oil fields drilling for oil, and lots of different operators in the refining sector of the business. And there are, especially once you get into the refining process, there are advantages to being big. Economists call these economies of scale. So there are economies of scale. If you can build a refinery that's 10 times bigger than the average one, then your cost of refining a barrel of oil and producing gallons of kerosene, your cost per unit is going to be less than the cost of the smaller operators. And this was the secret of John Rockefeller's success. He was able to go big while other people were remaining small. Now some of this was just he was there ahead of the curve. Some of it was a result of his ambition. Rockefeller would acknowledge in later days that he wanted to make something of himself. He wanted to be a big deal. There are people who go into business who are perfectly happy or reasonably happy having a business that supports themselves, supports them and their families. But they don't want to necessarily be the biggest honcho around. That wasn't what Rockefeller wanted. He wanted to be number one. Exactly why? It's hard to say. Maybe he wanted to prove something to his father, prove something to himself, who knows. But there was something in him. There was that ambition. I guess I should add that this idea of advancing, of becoming bigger and better, it shows up in all sorts of aspects of human life. And people who are good at something tend to continue to do that thing and to move up the scale of doing that thing, sort of until they discover they've reached the top level of their expertise. And so if you learn to play the piano when you're a kid and your teachers think you're good, then you go and learn more, and maybe eventually you'll become a professional musician. You'll become a pianist or something like that, and maybe you'll play in the New York Philharmonic. But you sort of keep going because you've been getting all these pats on the back for being good at it. Same thing is true if you're an athlete. If you're a good football player, or basketball player, or volleyball player in elementary school, then everybody says you're good. Try out for the next team, and you keep going until maybe you play in the pros, or maybe discover that the varsity team in high school is as far as you can go, and beyond that, other people are better than you. But as long as you are good at something, there seems to be this innate tendency of humans to keep doing those things that you're good at doing. Anyway, so in the case of John Rockefeller, he was really good at making money, really good at running business, really good at controlling the refining process of America's oil markets. Anyway, so he got good at it, and he got bigger. And there was this positive feedback loop, again, referring to these economies of scale that I mentioned. So the bigger you get, the more efficient you become, and the better able you are to outproduce, to outcompete those other firms in the field. And so as Rockefeller got bigger, he was able to undercut the prices of his competitors. And oil being a commodity where 1 quart of oil looks, 1 quart of kerosene, 2-gallon tin of kerosene looks like pretty much any other 2-gallon tin of kerosene. It was a matter of competing on price. And because he could produce at a lower cost than his competitors, people gravitated in his direction. Now beyond this, Rockefeller seemed to have this notion that he was on a divine mission to to make the American oil industry more efficient. In his later years, he lived a long time. In his later years, he was asked, how did he make his money? And he said, God gave me my money. So, God didn't just hand it to him. He had to go out and work for it. But Rockefeller seemed to believe, he was a devout Baptist, and he seemed to believe that God had somehow preordained that he, John Rockefeller, if he worked hard and did if he pulled up his end of it, that he would succeed. And so there was this kind of missionary zeal to what he was doing. And it encouraged him to continue to do more. He appreciated being wealthy, but even in those days, as in today, once you get beyond a certain point, once you've got more money than you could ever spend, as long as you live, then something else has to be involved. And with Rockefeller, there was kind of, call it an aesthetic sense of what he was doing. Rockefeller was offended by inefficiency. And the inefficiencies that he saw in this fractionated oil market made him think, no, we need to improve the efficiency of the industry as a whole. And he recognized the value of competition, but he thought competition could be overblown. Once competition got to the point where you were pretty efficient, then competition tended to get in the way. And Rockefeller exhibited something that was common in American economic history at that time. And you see it again and again. And I'll sort of boil it down to a phrase that sounds somewhat paradoxical, but it is that in certain instances, as in the instance of John Rockefeller, capitalists themselves become the biggest enemies of capitalism. Now, again, that should sound paradoxical. Capitalists against capitalism? Yeah, in the following sense. Capitalism is the system of economy based on private ownership of property and means of production, factories and all that stuff, and free markets include competitive markets. Now, capitalists, big capitalists like Rockefeller, he's all in favor of private ownership. He doesn't want anybody coming in and taking over his property. But he wasn't crazy about competition. In fact, he spent much of his adult working life trying to get rid of competition, and more precisely, trying to get rid of his competitors, because he had this idea that if a bigger factory is more efficient than smaller factories, then the biggest factory of all should be the most efficient of all. So his goal was to eliminate the competition so that his Standard Oil Company, which is what he called it, his Standard Oil Company would essentially refine all the oil in America. He came pretty close to it. There was a time where Standard Oil was refining between 92 and 93% of all the oil products that Americans used. Now, in effect, that is a monopoly. It's hard to get any more than that, in part because companies are going in and out of business all the time, and you can't get rid of them forever. And also, there's a political angle to this, because by this time, various people in the political arena, nudged by Rockefeller's competitors, were saying, this guy's gotten too big, he's gotten too powerful. And so, it would have been possible for Rockefeller to take his 92% and increase it to 95%, 96%, perhaps. But it would have been costly, and it probably would have brought down on his head even more political opposition and criticism than he was getting already. So he let it slide at that. But the way he would consolidate, the way he would handle things, was to basically, he would send his agents. After a while, he just ran the place from his offices, and he would send out agents. And these agents would go out into a new market where Standard Oil wanted to do business. And Standard Oil's agents, Rockefeller's agents, the lawyers, would go out and they would meet with the owner of this production facility, this refinery, and they would say, "Nice business you got there. How would you like to sell it?" And if the owner said, "Oh, okay, I'll sell it. Well, you pay me," and Rockefeller was famous for paying fair prices. He knew what the capacity, what the profitability of a particular refinery was, and he'd pay a fair price. He would pay a fair price. If the refiner, this small company, said, no, I like my refinery, I'm going to stay at it, he said, okay, well, you've been warned because we're coming in and we're going to run you out of business. And in fact, this is exactly what Rockefeller would do. He would open up operations in that corner of Ohio or that part of Pennsylvania or that whatever the state was. And because his production costs were lower than the production costs of the person he was going to run out of business, he would sell his product at a price below what the smaller producer was selling it at. And again, because oil from kerosene is pretty much undifferentiated, nobody is name branded oil, and certainly they weren't in those days. If it cost a little bit less to get Rockefeller's oil than the oil of this other guy, the other guy would go out of business. And so there were all sorts of competitors to Rockefeller who tried to stand up to him, and almost none of them survived. The smart ones, when Rockefeller would offer to buy them out, he would give them a choice if they could have cash, so they get the money right away, or they could get shares of stock in Standard Oil. Now, the really insightful ones took the shares of stock because Rockefeller was going places with this. And in fact, those people who did take Standard Oil stock, they often got rich as a result of this. They basically retired and they got rich. And maybe they weren't as happy as they would have been had they still been running their own businesses, but Rockefeller could assuage any pangs of conscience by saying, I made these people rich. And furthermore, and here's the key, and this is for those of us who are looking at it from more than a century distant, but I would say that this applies to people who look at big fortunes today. Jeff Bezos, for example, with Amazon, or Bill Gates at Microsoft, Mark Zuckerberg with Facebook, the really successful businesses today. How do they justify what they're doing? How did Rockefeller justify what he was doing? How did Rockefeller justify the fact that he was wealthier as a result of his efforts and all this other stuff, that he was wealthier than 10,000 of the people who worked for him and then 50,000 of his customers? How did he justify this? Well, the way he justified it was, I gave people what they wanted. They have to take the example of this 2-gallon tin of kerosene. I gave people the opportunity to light their lives. And furthermore, the price, as Rockefeller's fortune was going up, the price of that 2-gallon tin of kerosene was going down, down, down. So he could look himself in the mirror, or he could look critical politicians in the face and say, I have made lives better for people. I didn't extort money out of people. Nobody had to buy my product. Now, that wasn't exactly right, because if you wanted the kerosene, you pretty much had to buy Rockefeller's kerosene. But on the other hand, they didn't have to buy the kerosene at all. They could go back to using candles. So he could say, I've made people's lives better. And I've done it at a declining cost over time. What more can you ask of business? What more can you ask of a businessman? And if you put the question to Jeff Bezos, for example, today, the wealthiest man in the world today, how did he make his money? By giving people the opportunity to buy what they want. They can go online, they can buy pretty much anything that they want. I don't put a gun to anybody's head. Nobody has to buy on Amazon. Why do people buy on Amazon? Because they like the prices, they like the delivery, they make their choice. And so this is the justification this is justification given by the really wealthy capitalists. Certainly was the justification given by John Rockefeller. And it's a fair question for us, for you, for me, for anybody, judging Rockefeller, looking at Rockefeller, looking at Jeff Bezos, looking at anything. Is this an argument that you buy? Is this good enough? Because one of the things that became apparent in American life during Rockefeller's day was that there was this sorting out of the really rich from everybody else. Now, I should point out that the overall standard of living of Americans was rising during this time. So Americans were getting better off, but Rockefeller was getting way better off. And is that fair? Is that right? And it's a question that Americans have dealt with economically, politically, culturally, socially, from that time until today. And there's great concern over rising inequality. And John Rockefeller would have said, inequality, that's not the issue. The issue is people's lives getting better. And he would say, judging by the fact that they buy my product and they seem to like it, yeah, lives are getting better. So if you want to be rich as Rockefeller, sort of that's what you do. Maybe today you ought to model yourself more after Jeff Bezos. But the idea is essentially the same.